Because they were terrible, right?
We're going to use that as our excuse.
Sure, why not? That's as good as any.
Yeah, right.
All right, I think I finally got this thing so it will work for us today. Let me get to the right frame here. Good. All right, I'm going to finish up with chapter 5 today, I promise. So then we're going to go on to 6. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks back, I think when you were gone, Pastor, that the book of Acts, in my view, is kind of like the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is a book of firsts. All kinds of firsts in the book of Genesis. You know, first, the first sin, the first man, the first creation, the first fall, judgment, the first murder, and so on. In the book of Acts, we have a lot of firsts, too. We have the first resurrection of Christ. We have the first indwelling of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. We have the first sermon by Peter. We have the first miracle with the healing of the lame man as Peter and John are going into the temple. We have a lot of firsts. Next week, we'll get into chapter 6, where we will have the first appointment of deacons, which will have some relevance to us, what the requirements were for a deacon, what they were to do, and how they were to be the right-hand men, really, to the apostles, to help the apostles free themselves up for their main task. And yet we see with these men who are named as deacons, they themselves were very evangelical. Stephen, preaching the gospel. Philip, with the Ethiopian eunuch and all that. We see these very godly, spirit-filled men who were not only deacons helping the apostles, but they themselves were very evangelical in carrying the gospel wherever they had the opportunity. Now, we're looking at Acts 5. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I've read it before. But just to highlight, we'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version tonight, this morning. After they have preached earlier in chapter 5, after the judgment of Ananias and Sapphira, the priests and Sadducees are filled with indignation. They lay their hands on them. They put them in prison. But the angel of the Lord releases them and says, go back to the temple and continue to preach the gospel. They do so. The religious leadership sends to bring the apostles out and find that they're gone. And not only are they gone, but they are back in the temple again preaching as they were commanded. And so now these very courageous men bring them very carefully because they don't want to get the crowd all mad and stone them. And they ask them, did we not tell you you're not to preach in this name? Well, Peter and the disciples basically say, you have no authority over us. God has commanded us to do what we're doing. We are the witnesses of his resurrection. He, the one who you recently put on the cross, he has now been exalted. He's at the right hand. He's a prince and a savior for Israel. We are his witnesses, and we are declaring that to you. And then we have Gamaliel. I want to do a little more research. I don't know a whole lot about Gamaliel. I haven't done a lot of research on him. But in a moment of apparent reason, he stands up and he says, leave these men alone. If this is nothing, it will come to nothing. But if it is, then you risk fighting against God himself. Leave it alone, let these guys go, and it will either live its own life or it will die its own death. Reasonable. He's highly reputed. The men accept his advice and say, okay. So they let these guys go, and they depart rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for Christ's name. And it tells us that they again return to daily preaching in the temple and in every house. They cease not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. Now we know that by this time in chapter 5, the number of souls that are saved are in the thousands. 5, 10, who really don't have good numbers on them. But the early church did not consist of a building. There were no buildings, no church buildings where these people were meeting, but rather they were meeting in the temple. They were meeting in private homes. So that the church are the people. The church is the people, the people of the Lord, the believers. It's not the buildings. God has no great love for the vast cathedrals that the Roman church built throughout the Middle Ages. God's not impressed with that kind of thing. His church are the Waldensians who meet in the mountains, secretly. His church are those people who are meeting in the woods, in the fields, His church would be the persecuted Christians in Russia who meet out in the woods and in the fields to get away from the so-called state-sanctioned churches and the state authorities. So that's his church. Now, I believe I finally got this worked. I got another testimony of a Jewish believer I think you'll find interesting. I enjoy this one. This guy is very thoughtful in how he came to Christ in faith. It's interesting. Last night, I'm trying to get my arms around, or my head around, what is it about modern Judaism that rejects Christ? What is it about Jesus as Messiah, Yeshua, that they reject? What's their argument against him being their Messiah? Why will they not accept him as Messiah? I've been going to different websites, and I went to one last night called Jews for Jesus. And I was just doing some research, and a little box pops up. Bing! Are you here? Why are you here? And I didn't know if I was getting an actual person or if I was just getting one of these auto response things. So I texted back, are you a person or is this an auto response? And she writes back, I am a person, my name is Allie. And we start talking. We had a real good conversation. I think she's Jewish. I didn't get a chance to find out because in the middle of our very interesting conversation, we lost our power last night. Went down. So we were out without power for a couple of hours. So I'm hoping to regain contact. But it was an interesting conversation, talking to her and getting her perspective on some of the things that the Jews put up as objections to Yeshua being their Messiah, their misunderstanding of what Messiah was going to do, what he's supposed to be, and all that sort of thing. But that was interesting, and I'm hoping to revisit that. But I got this video now we're going to look at. It's a little bit less than 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and see if we can get it going here. Or maybe not. What you doing?
He's talking about the Torah. He's talking about the prophets. Now that was another big aha moment. Whoa. That this Gentile God, if you will, is Jewish. I'm originally from New York City. Grew up in a Jewish home. When I was a child, I went to synagogue. I remember learning about Abraham, David and Goliath, learning to read Torah portion, learning to chant blessings. There was a religion that I was being taught that I learned pretty well, and an identity that I was taught and I learned pretty well. What it meant to be a Jew. But what about the God of the Jews? That was kind of like a missing piece. I was working as a camp counselor, beautiful place on the lakes, Lake Winnipesaukee up in New Hampshire. I began to look at the incredible creation, looking at the mountains, looking at the lakes, looking at the trees. For the first time in my life, something began to open up. There's no way that this could have happened just by itself. I had a friend back then who showed up at the camp just at the same time I did, another Jewish kid. He had a Bible with him, and that Bible included the New Testament. My first reaction was, why are you even looking at that? Why are you even considering that? What's the point? How could you, give that any regard at all? This was the Gentile religion. This was the non-Christian thing. This was the religion for those people. One day, and I really can't tell you why, maybe curiosity, I don't know. I opened up my friend's Bible. Now, I had never opened the New Testament in my life, and I looked at what Jesus was saying there. The first thing I read goes like this: Blessed are those who know their need of God. They shall be satisfied. I was never exposed to such a question, or never exposed to such a proposition. Hey, did you ever consider that you might need God? Something hit me here. Knowing your need of God. And for the first time in my life, I began to realize, something? I think I might need that. And the synagogue, like I said, it taught me about being Jewish. It taught me the stories of the Bible. But there's a difference between learning stories and knowing the author. If I could possibly come to a knowledge of him, not just know about him or not just know, what he said to do or not to do, if I could somehow know him, that would be the best knowing that there is. I began to seek in my heart, and I began to read more of this Jesus and the words of this Jesus. I learned that he's Jewish. He's talking about the Torah. He's talking about the prophets. He's talking about David. He's talking about Elijah. I was reading the words of a rabbi. This was not what I expected, opening up the Gentile Bible. He was addressing issues of my heart, how I should relate to other people, how God is so righteous and holy, and that he wants me in my heart to be righteous and holy. I know that I'm impure. I know that I'm not right. I know that there's so much imperfection, but I also see this perfection before me, this beauty before me. And I read in the Hebrew Bible how God's messenger, God's servant, was wounded. He was bruised for our iniquities, sins. Something had happened. Something had turned my heart around, and I became open to God and the fulfillment of everything that my upbringing pointed to. I was second semester in school. There was nobody in the dormitory room but me. And I had been reading and soaking it all in, thinking about it and mulling over this for months. But I got up from my bed, stood up, and I said to myself, I might as well just admit it. I believe this. This is who I am. I felt something, like physically, come over me. The top of my head and kind of going down. It was real. It was there. It was like almost physically you could feel it, but I knew that it was kind of like the air. It wasn't, you couldn't grasp it, but it's there. Came down. But most importantly, what this was saying to me, I remembered as clear as day. It was saying to me, son, what you have just said is the truth. As a Jew, believing in the Jewish Messiah, I'm more complete as a Jew than I ever was. When I opened up my heart to see beyond prejudice, to see beyond artificial walls that have been created over the centuries, and I began to understand that my faith is complete, that I do not have to wait forever to know who this Messiah is, who this one who is to come, who it is at the Passover that we're waiting for when we open up the door and look outside. I know who he is. I know that he needed to come as Messiah, the suffering servant, and that one day he will come again as Messiah, the King of Kings.
So that's one of them. I found this one to be very interesting. I enjoyed it very much. So, just going here. So that's the second one. We got many more coming. Again, I enjoyed talking to this gal last night online, and I told her, I said, she wanted to know what I was up to. I said, well, I'm doing this Sunday school class. I'm doing this thing on the history of the church. We're in Acts chapter 5, and I'm trying to get my arms around the Jewish perspective of the Messiah, why the original leaders hated Jesus so much, and why even today so many barriers are thrown up to keep the Jewish people from faith in Messiah. But then I told her, I said, I'm of the opinion that God's doing something very special right now in the hearts of individual Jewish people. It's just something more. I've never really gotten this sense before, but I feel like God's doing something here with the Jewish people, bringing more and more individual Jews who are questioning and seeking to faith in Him, faith in Jesus Christ. And I just think, I said, this is just exciting to me. And this is what I'm about. That's what I'm trying to convey to the class. So we're at the persecution, and as I mentioned last week, persecution more often than not. These disciples were persecuted by the religious leadership at the time, the Jewish leaders, and persecution more often than not does come from the Jewish leaders. Or not the Jewish, but the religious leadership. The religious leadership, whether it's the Pharisees for the Jews, or the Pope for the Catholics, or whoever it is, it's the religious leadership who's trying to keep you away from the truth and to keep you from discovering the false system they've set up. That's why they'll persecute you. In the Reformation time, those men who were trying to translate the Bible into the various European languages, they were heavily persecuted. The church didn't want the people to look into the Bible and see that the Bible said nothing about purgatory. The Bible said nothing about venerating saints. The Bible had nothing to say about paying for indulgences. The Bible had nothing to say about any of these things. And they didn't want the people to find that out. So those who were engaged in translation work were hunted down, persecuted, and in the case of William Tyndale, taken to the stake and burned to death. So the fiercest persecution will come from religious leadership. And we will say, as we go through Acts now, we're going to see that the persecution kind of goes back and forth. First, it's the Jewish leaders that are doing it. Then the Roman leaders are doing it, sometimes in conjunction with each other. Satan is using both of them to try to stamp out and tamp down the spread of the church. Because the Bible tells us that Satan is the prince of the power of the air. This is his domain within the parameters God has set up. He has allowed a certain amount of free reign. And we are in his territory. We are, and he's going to do everything he can to fight us. So after this first round, the second round of persecution, we see that the fact that they were going to be persecuted was not something that they were surprised by, because Christ had promised to them that they would eventually be persecuted. Matthew 5:10-12. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when all manner of evil against you, or when they shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. 2 Timothy 3:12. Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. 1 Peter 3:14. And if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. And this is Peter. Peter himself experienced their persecution. He knew what he was talking about when he wrote this. John 5:18-21. If the world hated you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love you, but because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you, remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. But these things will they do unto you for my name's sake, because they know not him that sent me. John 16:1-4. These things have I spoken unto you, that ye should not be offended. They shall put you out of the synagogue. Yea, the time come that whosoever shall killeth you will think that he doth God's service. Matthew 24:9. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. So Christ promised his disciples that if you live for me and you are vigorously, honestly pursuing the Great Commission, you are going to be opposed, and it may cost you your life. So there's a pattern I see here, a repeating pattern as we look at the persecution in Acts. First, we have prayer. We see that the believers gather together and they pray to God. And then they have a manifestation of the Holy Spirit's power. At Pentecost, it was speaking in tongues. Sometimes it's the shaking of the building. But there's this manifestation of Holy Spirit power as a result of their prayer. And then there's preaching to the people. Great works and miracles are performed, which provide the opportunity for Peter and the other disciples to proclaim the gospel to people, because, you see a man who's been lame since birth, and he's up and walking around, it's going to draw a crowd. People are going to come in wanting to know what's going on. You got yourself a ready-made sermon. You got yourself a ready-made Billy Graham-style crusade with people all around you that you can preach the gospel to. Then as they preach, the religious leadership is filled with indignation. They don't like what's going on. They grab these men and they throw them in prison. And they get an opportunity to preach to Jewish leaders. Their sermon doesn't stop. They get an opportunity to preach directly to these leaders who are persecuting them and reminding them of their own personal guilt in the crucifixion of Christ. Their guilt in rejecting the Messiah, and the Jewish leaders, they hate this. And it fills them with even more wrath and indignation, and they're determined to try to put these men to death and stamp out what they're preaching. They prohibit the preaching. These men say, we're going to obey God, not you. They persevere and continue to preach. They are preserved. We see that many times when they are apprehended and thrown into prison, that the angel of the Lord releases them and they are freed. Rejoicing. They rejoice that they're counted worthy to suffer persecution for Christ. And then their preaching is renewed. They continue to preach. And we see progress. The church, in spite of Satan's efforts to stop it, the church continues to grow and to spread. And we will see later, a couple chapters away, where persecution actually itself is a vehicle for spreading the gospel. As the early believers try to seek relief from persecution, they spread out throughout the empire, taking the gospel with them to other places. So actually, it's like trying to put an oil fire out with water. It doesn't put it out; it just spreads it. So. You have to remember that the persecutor in chief here is Satan himself. He is the enemy of God and his people since the beginning of time. He instituted, or he motivated Cain, to rise up and slay Abel, the first martyr for righteousness' sake. He is the instigator of all persecution, but only within the parameters allowed by God. We know that in Job, God allowed Satan to go after Job, but God set up parameters, said you can only go so far, but no farther than this. Ultimately, it was, you can do whatever you want to Job, but don't take his life. We have Jezebel's murder of the prophets. Jezebel also rose up, false witnesses against Nabal to steal his vineyard, put him to death. Satan has been responsible for the blood of all the prophets, as indicated in Luke 11:50 and 51, and Hebrews 11:37. And as I mentioned, Satan is the present ruler of this world. It's his domain that we're operating in, and we are insurgents behind enemy lines. We are like, it's a terrible analogy. We're like the special forces. We're behind the enemy lines, seeking to win those to Christ who are in darkness. And of course, Satan will use every available wicked means to stop God's people. And he was the inspiration behind the plot to murder Jesus. So, the Jewish leaders at the time, why did they hate Jesus so much? What was it they hated about him? First of all, he upset their man-made traditions. He and his disciples are going through the field. His disciples are plucking corn and eating it without washing their hands. And they accuse Christ. Why are your disciples eating without washing their hands? You're violating our traditions. That makes us angry. He openly accused them of hypocrisy. Many times he called them, you're hypocrites. You require this, you require that, but inside you yourselves, you're wicked. You are whitewashed sepulchres full of dead men's bones and corruption. And he openly accuses them of hypocrisy. And by his own life, and by comparison, his life exposes them for their hypocrisy. He lives what he preaches. They do not live what they preach. He shows mercy and love to those that the religious leadership despised. Who does Jesus consort with and associate with when he's engaged in his earthly ministry? He is sitting down with publicans and sinners. He's associating with people that the religious leadership hates and despises, and their self-righteousness, they find themselves to be better than these people, and they'll have nothing to do with them. So he's again, just by example, is showing them for their hypocrisy. These so-called men of God have no mercy and compassion for those that they consider to be beneath them. He violates their scruples about the law and their traditions. We have the occasion where there's the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath, and the religious leaders are looking on him to see if he's going to heal this man on the Sabbath or not. And what's he say to them? He says, is it better to do good or do evil on the Sabbath? To kill or to kill or to make alive? He looks upon them with anger, and then he heals the guy's man in front of their face. And they are so angry at this point that they're conspiring to try to put him to death and destroy him. They also hate him because he has growing popularity with the people because of the miracles and wonders that he does. He is claiming that he is the Son of God. He is claiming he is the Messiah. He walks in Luke, he goes into the synagogue. They hand to him the scroll of Isaiah. He reads from Isaiah about the coming Messiah, and he says, this day is this coming to pass. And he declares himself to be their Messiah. And anybody could claim to be Messiah, and if you had no works or wonders to back it up, well then, your claims are empty. But if you claim to be Messiah, God's chosen one, and you've got the works and the wonders to back it up, that's a different story. And the people are drawn to Christ and attracted to him because his works, the things he does, backs up who he says that he is. And this, again, the religious leadership hates this, and he threatens to overthrow their position and their power. He upset their stereotypes about him. In Matthew 13:55, they say, is this not Jesus, the son of the carpenter, the son of Mary? Who is this guy? And they reject him. His own hometown rejects him. And Christ says, a prophet has no honor in his own country. But they had the stereotype about him, and he has upset that. He is more and beyond what they thought him to be. And this also makes them angry. And he begins to increasingly claim that he is the Messiah. He refers to himself in messianic terms, often as the Son of Man. He also says that he is also a threat to their position and their way of life. The religious leadership at the time had this precarious balance between the Jewish people and Rome. They wanted to preserve this. They didn't, and every time somebody came up making a messianic claim, the Jewish leadership thought this threatened their position, and that Rome would come in and put them down, put them out of their position. They'd lose their authority, they'd lose their wealth, they'd lose their position. Jesus coming forward saying that I am the King of the Jews, I am the Messiah, this was a great threat to their position. They feared that Rome would come away and take away, as I say, both their place in nation. So, they threatened to upset the precarious balance they had achieved with Rome. And most of all, the thing that they hated the most about Jesus is that he made himself to be equal with God. He claimed that he was the Son of God, and this was the thing that they could not tolerate, and it was the primary reason it was the primary accusation they were able to use against him in order to engineer his death. So, from the very beginning, the Jewish religious leadership has hated Yeshua. They have maintained and propagated and perpetuated that hatred all the way down to today's time. And I wanted to do a little research and find out what are the present arguments that the Jewish establishment uses against Yeshua being their Messiah. I wanted to kind of look through a few of these and see what what their perspective is. And then perhaps next week or sometime down the future, we'll come up with some biblical refutations of their views. First of all, the first thing they'll tell you is, well, Jesus is the author of Jewish persecution. The Christian church has persecuted Jews throughout history. Jesus, and as you will hear with these testimonies, most of these people do not even realize that Jesus is Jewish. They think he's some sort of Gentile God. And they'll tell you, too, that they're told that the New Testament is nothing more than a manual on how to persecute Jewish people. So, there's this big thing. If somebody is thinking about Jesus or contemplating him as Messiah, the answer is, well, no. He's the author of persecution. The New Testament is a book on persecuting Jews. This is not for us. The New Testament, they will say, is a manual for persecuting Jews. And you'll hear many testimonies where they'll admit that this is what they thought. Converting to faith in Yeshua is a big deal for a Jew. And it will mean denying one, and they say it means denying one's own Jewishness. The Jewish leadership will say, you cannot be a believer in Yeshua and still remain a Jew. You're going to deny your Jewishness. Well, this has a lot of weight with most people, But some, when they finally realize Jesus is Messiah, they're willing to suffer this loss of Jewish identity, if indeed there really is one. And then there's this, Jews do not believe in Jesus. That's the first thing they throw up. You try to talk to a Jew, I'm a Jew, and that's supposed to end the argument. Now, I haven't had Jews say that to me, but during the, when we'd go out on visitation at Calvary, you'd knock on their door, and the first thing out of somebody's mouth, you tell them who you are, what you're there for, they'll say, I'm a Catholic. And that's supposed to stop the conversation. You don't go any farther. But my response was, I didn't ask you if you're a Catholic. I asked you, do you know if you're going to heaven? Do you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? I'm a Catholic. I don't want to talk. So, okay, you walk away. But, that's supposed to end all the discussion, all the argument. And as I was telling this lady last night online, I said, Phariseeism is not limited to the Pharisees. The papists do the same thing. This is something that's in the heart of every man. We're always thinking that we can somehow get to heaven on our own works, and makes us feel good about ourselves. There is also this fear of alienation from family and friends for following Yeshua, and in some cases it actually does happen. You'll hear some testimonies of these guys. They say that they'll go and first they will fear telling mom and dad that they've become a believer in Yeshua, but after some time they feel impressed upon to do so, and sometimes the response is not pretty. It's pretty ugly. The family will disown them and regard them as dead to the family. They will say that Jesus did not fulfill the requirements for Messiah. One, they claim that the Messiah would never claim to be God or the Son of God, but yet if you go in the Old Testament, you will find references to the fact that God's servant was his son. And we'll look at those at some point down the road. Messiah would bring peace, but there's no peace, so Jesus could not possibly have been the Messiah. But the Jewish view, they only see one advent. They don't see two. They don't see a first advent and a second advent. They don't realize the first advent, the purpose of that was he did bring peace. He brought peace between me and my God. He brought peace between Neil and God. He brought peace between us as individual sinners and God. That was the peace he brought during his first advent. On his second advent, when he comes as King of Kings, he will bring peace to the world and will rule the nations from Jerusalem, and there will be an era of peace. But they don't see the two-part advent of Messiah, one first as the suffering servant, and the second one as the King of Kings. Now, how do they explain away Isaiah 53? And you will hear again in these testimonies, these believers, as they're seeking the Lord as Jews, they come to Isaiah 53, and their first response is, what's Jesus doing in my Bible? They read this, and they see this is talking about Jesus. What does the Jewish leadership say? They try to claim that the servant in Isaiah 53 is not the Messiah, but is the nation of Israel. But it doesn't fit. It's an exercise in semantics and mental gymnastics, but clearly when these Jewish believers see Isaiah 53 for the first time, their first inclination is, this is Jesus. This is talking about Jesus, the Messiah. And usually it's the kicker for most of them. It's the thing that tips them in favor of the fact that Jesus was their Messiah, and they're now willing and ready to receive him as their Messiah. So are there any questions or comments on what we've looked at so far this morning?